Today on Tactical Tuesday, John and I are bringing to you our top 4 poker tips as ranked by ChatGPT. I'm going to say a tip, he's going to say a tip. You guys down below can judge which of our tips you believe to be the most valuable to you and your game. So let's start it out. John, what is your 4th best tip?
Okay, so my 4th best tip is to pay attention to hands that you are not playing or hands that you haven't V-pipped. Pay attention specifically to showdowns and what people get to the river with, what people call the river with, what people bluff the river with, how thinly they're value betting. This is going to tie into a future tip, but I think this is one of the most important things that you should be doing when you're playing both online poker or live poker is just paying attention to what everyone else is doing so that you know how to exploit them. You know who's not bluffing, who's bluffing too much, et cetera, et cetera.
Wow, that's your 4th best tip. So I can't imagine what your best tip is because that was actually really good. It makes me sad that I'm feeling a little anxious about what I'm about to come with. My 4th best tip is that when betting or raising feels obvious, you're oftentimes in a spot where slow playing is extremely valuable. I think this tip is something that I preach to the wolves all the time. And when you're trying to get value from your opponent, a lot of that value comes from letting them bluff. And a lot of times, I think the most unprotected part of our strategies are when we check. And when we check, opponents are likely to put more money in the pot in one way or the other through calling a future really big bet or through bluffing themselves. So whenever you have a really, really strong hand and it feels very slam dunk, very obvious to bet, oftentimes you should ask yourself, well, maybe this hand I should check. Like, well, what happens if I check this exact hand?
Oh, you went like way more strategy specific or detailed strategy than I would. My tips are going to be a little bit more big picture. That's a really good one though. I mean, that's something that we talk a lot about with the wolves too. So okay. Well, I think these are going to be hard to rank which ones are better or worse, but I think I think my tips are going to have a little bit more mass appeal.
Okay, your
than
tips
you're
might
going
have
right
more
now.
mass appeal, but mine will hit one person really, really hard and make an impact on one person out there. What's the next one?
Okay. Tip number 3 for me is positional advantage is probably more important than you think it is. It's something that I've heard ever since I started studying poker, taking poker seriously. Is position is important. Position is important. And every single point in my career where I'm like, oh, like I think I finally have the correct amount of respect or understanding of how important position is. I'm like slammed in the face again by like another example of like, hey, by the way, I'm still probably underrating how important position is. I've recently started studying some PLO, and again, like I'm just going through the same experience I had in the last couple of years of playing No Limit, where I'm just like, yeah, every single hand I play, I'm just consistently reminded of how important position is. So my tip is if you are going to be selective, or if you're trying to be selective about the starting hands that you're going to play in both a cash game or a tournament, again, both like online and live, and it feels like a close decision, I would lean towards playing tighter from early position and opening up my range from later position so that I'm playing more hands when I have positional advantage and playing fewer hands when I'm out of position. But that is my 3rd tip, is that positional advantage.
So
Probably
the Kama Sutra
probably
of
underrated.
poker coming soon by Jonathan Chai. It's all about different positions. My 3rd poker tip. I don't know if that one is better than your 4th one, by the way. I'm not sure about your rankings. We'll see. My 3rd poker tip is that digging deeper is always more valuable than staying on the surface. I think that a lot of times we look at some sort of study material and we just kind of accept it and try to like copy paste what's going on in our own games, and it doesn't really work out. And it's because we don't understand the underlying principles of kind of what's going on in that spot and how that spot works. And so I think that like if your study habits include going very shallow review in 50 different spots, I think you should instead focus and go very, very deep in like 2 different spots to really understand how things work. And then once you go really deep in a spot, you can actually apply principles and concepts that you learn pretty broadly. And I found that like there's just so much value in going deeper than staying surface level. I think it's actually kind of a poker superpower that helps you improve much more quickly, ironically, than otherwise.
Yeah, that's really funny. Like I've, how many times has anyone, or including myself, like just clicked through a solver and been like, yep, 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 like flop size, turn size, river size, like action, like those are all good, and without actually learning anything. So yeah, that one definitely resonates with me too. Is always try to go deeper into a spot or turn card type or something like that instead of just glossing over the hand. Um, I'm gonna start getting into some of my more strategic chip tips now. Number 2 for me is that your chip should always be going into the pot with a purpose. And what I mean by that is that when you're bluff catching, you should always have some sort of idea what type of bluffs you should expect to see, or you expect your opponent to show up with. When you're value betting, you should always have some type of idea of what type of bluff catchers you're targeting in your opponent's range. And when you're bluffing, you should always have a type of idea of like what types of hands or what types of combos you expect your opponents to fold on the river, for example. So, one thing that I see all the time in private coaching sessions and Wolf applicants is just, player makes a bet or calls a bet, and I ask them like, what do they expect to happen, or what do they hope happen? And sometimes I get like blank stares. So, tip number 2 for me is always make sure that you have a purpose when you are putting chips in the pot. Doesn't matter whether you're putting them in your like aggressively putting them in or bluff catching.
I really
You
love
always
that,
have to have
and
some sort of target.
I'll expand a little bit further and say like have a purpose when you don't put chips in the pot, when you fold, when you check. Have a purpose behind every single action that you take. Have a plan, have an idea, and then afterwards measure yourself on if I were targeting second pair to fold, but I got bluff caught by second pair, like what went wrong? Do I need to calibrate? Do I need to go deeper into this spot? My number 2, and by the way, that really, really, really good one. I can't wait for your number 1 tip, by the way, if that's number 2. My number 2 is the absence of an action is oftentimes just as important as the action itself. And I think that in poker, a lot of times we don't think about removal by our opponents choosing one size over another size or one action over another action. A lot of times, to kind of piggyback off your number 2 tip, sometimes people bet and do things without a purpose, right? They just do things kind of arbitrarily. And so, you know, try to discern what your opponent's doing by what they're not doing. Take things off the board to have a better idea of like, what is my opponent trying to accomplish here? If they bet pot, that means they didn't bet 75% pot. It means they didn't bet 50% pot. If they overbet, then they didn't bet 75% pot, or they didn't check. If they check, they didn't bet. So a lot of times when you're playing against especially weaker opposition, you can read a ton into what people are not doing and make really informed decisions that are just, gonna make you a lot of money when you're at the table. So, yeah, that's my number 2 tip.
That's when like the best soul reads happen. That's when like the best soul reads happen, right? Is when you can just like eliminate everything down to like one combo and just be like, okay, like because of the actions that you've taken up till this point and the sizes that you've used, I'm pretty sure you only have king 10 of diamonds here on the turn or on the river or something like that. And you can only make those insanely sick soul reads.
Yeah, it's like Guess Who, right? If you imagine the hand grid, you're just like ticking off hands, and at the end when you make a soul read, there's one hand left.
All right, my fourth and final tip, or I guess the one that I think is most important, is don't be afraid to exploit specific player types. And kind of tagging along with that, don't fall into the trap of kind of trying to play GTO versus opponents that are not clearly not playing GTO themselves. The way that this I think manifests is it doesn't matter if you're at the top of your range. If your opponent has no bluffs in a spot, which very frequently happens when you're playing live poker, for example, don't be afraid to fold the top of your range because you're not going to be making money by calling down in a spot where your opponent has no bluffs. If you're playing versus a whale that never folds, don't bluff a combo just because the solver tells you to, bluff a combo on the river. Like the right adjustment or the exploit to make in those situations is to not bluff versus the guys who overcall and not call versus the guys who underbluff. And I think that's this is the tip that I said ties into paying attention to hands that you're not in. This is like where you get to exploit all the attention that you've been paying to, figure out who's not folding, who's bluffing too much, who value bets, too tight. And so you should be really, really, really conservative with your bluff catchers. Don't be afraid to make wild adjustments based on player type is
Yeah, I mean that's
number one.
just an incredible one, right? When somebody bets pot on the river, if you don't have 33% equity with the top of range bluff catcher, you still don't get to call. no matter if you're top of range or not a top of range, right? Like if they only have 10% bluffs and you need 33% equity to call, you're still torching, even if you have the best hand in your range in that spot.
I can't fold this hand. If I fold this hand, I'm folding everything. Like that's I think that's the exact line that my
No,
tip is
we're
trying to
good.
convey. Oh,
It
sorry, didn't mean
leads
to cut
into
you off.
my number one tip, and that's when you feel yourself lost in a hand, to retrace your steps, to go backwards. Whenever you're at a decision point and you don't know what option is good or no option looks appealing, try to take a step back and see what you did on the turn. Like if you're betting the river and you don't have any bluffs, well, how did you make it to the river in the first place, right? What led you to getting in this spot where you don't have any bluffs? And then think strategically about the spots before it, right? Kind of leading all the way back to typically pre-flop. And I just think that a lot of times we focus on the problem at hand, and don't focus on what led to us getting in that situation in the first place. And I think if we focus more on being more strategic earlier, those problems would crop up less and less, and we would not have to struggle as much as we currently do. So, stop asking, what did I do wrong? What do I do here? And start asking yourself, what did I do that led me here?
Yeah, you're probably, if you're confused about what to do, it's very likely that it's something that you did on a previous street or an action that you took at a previous, node in the hand that is leading back to that confusion or leading you to realize that, like, hey, I actually have no bluffs once the river completes a flush because I don't check raise the flop with any hands that aren't flush draws or sets or anything like that. So now I just get to the river with really strong hands. I think that's like probably the most common example I hear of people falling into this pitfall. So yeah, that one makes a lot of sense. Is try to take it back a street or two if you find yourself completely
Yeah,
lost on.
I don't know who won
or something.
today's episode, but let me and John know in the comments below. And that's it for today's Tactical Tuesday, which is a little different than past ones, but let us know how it went. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.
This is Tactical Tuesday on Chasing Poker Greatness with your hosts, Brad Wilson and John Chai. Coach Brad approved. Are you a lone wolf searching for the ultimate pack? The CPG Wolf program is a close-knit brotherhood hell-bent on one thing only: chasing poker greatness. Powered by bleeding-edge wolf strats and led by Coach Brad and his lieutenants, CPG Wolves are systematically prepared for almost any spot they'll encounter on the green felt. If you want to plug into an elite team and have a step-by-step game plan to realize your full poker potential, you can apply at cpgwolves.com. Space is limited, and the pack is only as strong as its weakest member. So only the hungriest, grittiest, and most driven will be accepted into the program. Applications are open at cpgwolves.com.